Yeah. Okay.
Yes, you can turn on your camera if you'd like. Okay, I think we're live.
Okay. Can you see?
Yes. Hi everyone, good evening. Thanks for joining us. So, a quick introduction. I'm Tamanna Sangupta. I'm a volunteer with Fridays for Future India. Fridays for Future India is a youth led movement. We are fighting to demand climate action and demand climate justice. So, today is actually our Global Climate Strike Day, and India's theme, Fridays for Future India's theme, is the Year of Awakening. We want to bring attention to the fact that 2020 was the year where a lot of disasters kept coming at us, and it's probably time to wake up and think about what we've done and what we can do moving ahead. So, as a part of our strike events, we have a series of webinars led by experts. We have one such expert with us today. We have Katrina from Wild Otters Research with us. So, Katrina is an expert in otter ecology, and she is a conservationist based in Goa. Today, we're going to sit with her and learn about the smooth coated otter of Asia. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Katrina. I believe you have a presentation for us as well.
Yep, I do. Thank you very much. Okay, is that visible to everybody?
Yes, it is.
Okay, brilliant. Hello, everybody, and thanks for being here this evening. So, just a quick background. I work at an organization called Wild Otters Research, which is based in Sharau in Goa. And we are on an island surrounded by two rivers, the Mapsa River and the Mandovi River. And it's also an estuary, and predominantly the periphery of the entire island is made up of mangroves. So the mangrove ecosystem is one that has for decades and decades been, in a sense, not paid much attention to, because it was just considered something that grows alongside riverbanks in estuaries and coastal zones. But in actual fact, it plays a huge part in saving land masses in those areas exposed towards tidal movements. It's also very important in terms of the kinds of woods that it produces, the medicinal properties. It's also a nursery bed for a whole host of commercial fishing activities. So, in a sense, mangroves have a large amount of ecosystem services to humankind, and therefore are pretty important. And bearing that in mind, Wild Otters Research does a host of different sorts of projects in these ecosystems. And particularly right at this moment in time, we are paying close attention to the smooth-coated otter. So today I'm going to talk about the species and give you a very, very brief introduction to what smooth-coated otters are, where they live, and what kind of sort of habitats they require, just to give you an idea of the species and what their requirements are for their survival in the future. And of course, how we will discuss after the presentation how climate change might be affecting these habitats and species, etc. So there are 13 species of otter in the world. Some of them, most of them are terrestrial and aquatic. A couple of species are marine-based, which is the sea otter and the marine otter, which are found in North America and South America consecutively. In Asia, we have four species. So as you can see here, we have the Eurasian otter on the left, the smooth-coated otter, the hairy-nosed otter, and the small-clawed otter. And of all of these four species, the Eurasian otter, which is the one here on the left, has the largest range of all otter species in the world. and that pretty much extends all the way from Britain right across Europe into Southeast Asia. The smooth-coated otter, which I'm going to talk about in more detail through the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to leave out for now. The hairy-nosed otter, which is this guy here, is a very endangered species and it's found only in Southeast Asia. So it's endemic mostly to areas such as Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and parts of Indonesia, some of the islands of Indonesia. In the last few decades, it has almost been extinct in most of its range. It's a very solitary animal and not much is known about it. And finally, on the extreme right is the small clawed otter, which is the smallest of the 13 species of otter in the world. This is found in the Western Ghats in India. It's found in the Sundarbans in the east, and then extends all the way down into Southeast Asia. So these are the basic four, and in India we only, of course, as I said, get the three that I mentioned: the Eurasian, the smooth-coated, and the small-clawed. So just these are very anatomically precise sketches, and I know in the previous photograph for most people all otters look the same, but if you look at these images you kind of can tell the difference based on the shapes of the noses, and of course the hairy-nosed otter. This is called a rhinarium, which is the nose structure, and that actually has excessive amounts of hair on it, which allows it to actually forage in waters that are highly turbid, or in peat swamp forests where the water is really murky and you can't really see where you're going. So they actually use the hair that is on the rhinarium to form little bubbles, and then they breathe out and capture chemical signals through those bubbles and then get information of where their prey is. So they've specifically adapted to those sorts of habitats. And so if we look at the smooth-coated otter here, it looks quite different to the rest of the three species. It's got a much more rounded head. It's got this sort of T-structured nose. And these are the elements specifically that we look at when we're trying to distinguish between the different species. So the smooth-coated otter is found, as I said previously, throughout Southeast Asia and the subcontinent, but it also has a very small little population here in Iraq. And that is a genetically distinct population. It's called Lutragale perspicillata maxwelli. This little population here in Pakistan is also a distinct population, that is Lutragale perspicillata syndica. And then the rest of the blue pretty much makes up Lutragale perspicillata perspicillata. Now, these three subspecies, for those of you who don't know, a subspecies is essentially a species that has some sort of morphological or genetic variation, but not enough to make it a distinctive species by itself. And most of those traits would possibly be created or adapted based on the location where they are or isolated population genetics. So that's where they're found. In India, the Wildlife Protection Act has full protection for the smooth-coated otter. It's in Schedule 2, Part 1, which essentially means if you're caught with this animal, either dead or alive, you could either serve a prison term or pay a fine. Of course, it's not a very substantial fine and possibly not a deterrent, but that's where it is. It used to be in CITES Appendix 2 up until last year, which we actually helped to get moved up to Appendix 1. So that essentially means that no commercial trade is allowed in the species. It can only be exported between countries if it's going for scientific research, or if it's going to university, museums, or any sort of educational research-based needs. And on the IUCN red listing, it was last assessed in 2014, and based on that assessment, the species is considered vulnerable and possibly has an increased population decline. Now, we review this every 10 years, and possibly it can go to near threatened or it can go to endangered based on what the population sizes and ranges are at the end of those 10 years. The smooth-coated otter habitat. Now, this, amongst all the 13 species, seems to be one of the most adaptive species to habitat types. It ranges right from mangrove environments to coastal zones. It can be in intertidal zones, freshwater habitats. It's found, it was historically known only to be a lowland species, but recently there's been evidence of the species being in Bhutan, which is at more than 1,300 meters above sea level. You get them now adapting to human-dominated landscapes, which is where we are on Sharau. And of course, they are also found in plantations all throughout Malaysia, in palm oil plantations and things like that. They essentially like large rivers, deep, wide, sort of slow moving, not very high velocity or flow. Wetlands, they also adapt well to human-made reservoirs from tidal projects, hydel projects, and things like that. So it's got a very vast habitat requirement. Over here, there are 3 otters that are hiding in the mangroves here in Sharau. I hope some of you can spot them. I'll just give you a second to have a look. So essentially, there's one here who's eating a fish. There's one here looking at me. And then there's a third one also here eating a fish. So this is typically a fishing pool in Goa. This is a man-made fishing pool where it's auctioned every 6 months, and fishermen take over the site for 6 months. They feed it with fingerlings, they grow the fish, and then they commercially harvest it. And then the auction begins again, and it could be a new owner, etc., etc. And the mangroves are allowed to grow in these ponds, and these were not artificial. These were artificially planted in certain parts of the island, and now they have tended to just regenerate and grow themselves over the last 30-40 years. You can see buildings and stuff in the background over here as well. So this is completely a human-dominated landscape. This image is essentially showing you, so right now the image is taken while standing on a den site. So this is the entrance to an otter den. There are 2 entrances here, and this is sort of the water body and the sort of vegetation they require and prefer to make their dens. They need a little bit of vegetation cover. They need to be a certain distance away from the water's edge and things like that to set up their dens. Of course, with Goa, there is the issue of changing tides, so that water level keeps changing, which is not an issue in regular riverine environments. So again, the habitat requirements change depending on specific ecosystems and what those dynamics are. So as the name suggests, the smooth-coated otter does have a very sleek-looking coat, predominantly when it gets out of water. It can range in color from a rusty brown to gray, depending on which part of the range that the species is. And it has a whole load of whiskers, as you can see from this image. And yeah, this here gives you a little bit of scale. So they have very stubby legs and quite a big bulky body. And then they have this flattened tail that kind of acts like a rudder, and I've got more images of that coming up in the next few slides. They have this little bit of white that extends from the chin all the way halfway down towards the chest. Now, this is also a phenomenon that can change quite dramatically based on where the species is. In Singapore, for instance, that white chest ends pretty much over here, and then the rest of it is just gray. So we don't really use foliage or color to distinguish the species, because all of the species in Asia tend to have different coloration based on where they are. We use more of the anatomical, the skull structure, the shape of the nose, where the eyes are placed, those sorts of characteristics to define which species it is. Again, here you can see clearly that this is a carnivore. It's got the 2 large canines. So smooth-coated otters are apex predators in their environment, which essentially means that they are the top of the food chain. There is nobody that is predating on them. But they're not necessarily the only apex predators in the environment. For example, where we are based, there are also crocodiles in this environment. This is just some images showing you some more of the morphology. So one very distinguishing feature for otters is the fact that they have webbing on their front and hind legs. And that helps them with their aquatic lifestyle. It helps them swim and propel themselves through the water. It gives them a great amount of speed as well and dexterity when they are actually holding on to their food. Now, one of the differentiating factors between the smooth-coated otter and the small-clawed otter is actually the webbing. The small-clawed otter has much reduced webbing here, and that's essentially because of the type of food that they eat. They are more crab eaters than fish eaters, which is what they need more dexterous fingers to actually lift rocks and sort of pull out the crabs and to hold on to those whilst eating. So these are some of the defining characteristics of otters in general, and of course the smooth-coated otter in particular. So this here is just a video where you can see the movement of the smooth-coated otter. This is one that's just come out of the water. You can see the flat tail, the claws. So very briefly talking about the biology, the breeding season for the smooth-coated otter actually just finished. It's during the monsoon season, and again, this is something that is not greatly studied, so we don't have a lot of information. A lot of the research that has come out where there has been monsoon seasons during this time of the year, and there seems to be some sort of link between the monsoons and the reproductive behavior of the smooth-coated otter. One of the theories could be that productivity is highest during that period of time in terms of prey species availability. But yeah, they're going to have pups soon, sometime at the end of October and the beginning of November. And the pups are pretty much born helpless. They're born blind, so they stay inside the den for the first 4 to 5 weeks of their lives. They're blind, they can't really move much. And what we found during the course of our research is actually when the rest of the otters go out to forage and leave their pups behind, they tend to plug the holes so that the otters don't come out, or snakes and things don't get into the dens. So at about 4 to 8 weeks is when they start their first swimming lesson. So they're not born, they don't have the innate ability to swim. They actually are taught how to do that by their parents and the rest of their family members. And once they're ready for those swimming lessons, their natal den tends to be a little further away from the water's edge. And once the swimming lessons begin, that den is shifted more closer to the water's edge. Most of the time they're hauled around by the scruffs of their necks, as you can see here. Still very ungainly, and they tend to go on like this for 2 to 3 months, being pulled, carried around. They tend to be weaned at 5 months. At that point, they're also taught how to hunt and forage in water and get their own fish and whatever other prey sources that they have access to at that period of time. So this is just another image. So this is again a swimming lesson. You will also there are videos of otters actually pushing the young ones underwater for a period of time to just get them used to the idea of being underwater, and then they pull back up again. So it's quite interesting. So the most important things about smooth-coated otters are these behaviors that they do, which is, of course, I described already the movement and the swimming, which is they're using their webbed feet and they're using their flat tail as a rudder. The other thing that they do is spend pretty much all their time on land, either resting or grooming, and whatever time they have in water is foraging, reproducing, so they mate in water as well. The smooth-coated otter is a very social animal, so they spend a lot of time doing social activities, and a lot of things like defecation, grooming, all of those things are done as a social group. And I'm just going to go through some photographs to demonstrate those things. So this is essentially a pile of otters that are resting together. They are always touching. So they do something called allo grooming and auto grooming. That essentially means that they groom each other and they groom themselves. And these activities actually keep the social bond and teach the hierarchy of the social group. The social group structure essentially is a male and a female, which are the alpha male and the alpha female, and they are bonded for life. And they will have multiple litters as they go along. Now, it's thought historically that this pair is monogamous, but it's come to light that that may not be the case. But they will remain together as the head of that family. And family group size can be anywhere between 6, 8, 10, all the way to 27. 27 is the number I'm using because that's the largest group size I've seen. I'm sure they can be much larger than that as well. And again, that depends on the territory of the family, what the resources are in that specific area for that family, and things like that. On Sharau, we've got 3 or 4 different families, perhaps less. We're still not sure about that, but they have much smaller territory sizes. And one of the theories that we have, again, something that we're working on, is that the territory size is much smaller because the amount of food available is much more than in say a regular freshwater ecosystem. And that's because it's an estuary and it's rich and highly productive. So again, just demonstrating the social activity and the bonds that are created and the physical fact that exists. This image is essentially a bunch of otters standing up. This is what we call sentry behavior. So they're essentially standing up and being vigilant. They possibly could have heard some sort of sound that has disturbed them. They're all standing up and looking. If you look at this otter here on the left, she has this marking that you can see here. And this is an otter from Singapore who at a very young age got stuck in a plastic loop, and that loop wasn't taken out for the longest time, and she sort of grew into it till finally a veterinarian was able to tranquilize and get her out and release her from that plastic loop. And that mark, of course, has always remained. And they follow this family of otters based on that mark. So all smooth-coated otters pretty much look alike. So you can't distinguish them like how you would a tiger or a leopard because of this. Each of them has individual stripes and spots, but not the case with the smooth-coated otters. So we tend to actually use external scars and markings that they might get through fights or whatever other damage to identify family groups and then follow them that way. So this is just another image demonstrating social bonds. Again, you can see sentry behavior here on the left. This is a female. And again, you can see that there's multiple otters here with a lot of pups. Pups are always looked after by, it could be many litters, but the females from different litters will look after each other's litters. It's not like they look after only their litter. That's another interesting thing that we've noticed with smooth-coated otters. And that specifically, that observation has come from a population in Singapore. So a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of time is spent in water. That could be either foraging or playing around, goofing around. Mating behavior also takes place inside water. A lot of the territorial fights also take place in water. So that's another interesting behavior that was found from Singapore. When it comes to feeding and foraging, again, they will have something, they form a V in a sense, and the most advanced or the oldest members of the family group will be leading this V formation with the younger ones through the center. And what they do is then corral all the prey onto the shallower side of the river or whatever that water body might be. And that makes it easier for them to actually catch and feed on. Although extremely social animals, and they do pretty much everything together as a social group, they don't share food. Everyone catches their own food and eats their own food, and there's no question of anybody trying to grab food out of the other individual's hand. So that's, yeah, quite an interesting thing as well. They will also start eating the fish head first, and sometimes will discard. So if it's a large fish, they'll eat the best parts of it and discard the rest. If it is very large and it cannot be handled in water, then they will bring that large fish to shore. And in that case, they will eat mostly the center part, which is leaving the head out and leaving the tail out. They eat the center part and leave the rest. And that is something that field biologists look out for when they're doing surveys and looking out for otter presence. So they also eat crayfish. So predominantly 80% of smooth-coated otter diet is fish. And other than fish, they will go for shrimps, lobsters, crayfish. Sometimes, depending on the habitat type, so if it's a freshwater river that's drying out due to summer or something like that, they will also go for snakes, rodents, birds, and things like that, frogs as well. But predominantly fish is their choice prey. As I said, social behavior includes defecating. So this is again the entire family defecating at the same time. And here also there's a hierarchy and social construct. So once the entire family has defecated, the alpha or the leader of that group will come and do something called the poop dance, which is essentially use that flattened tail to spread the feces everywhere. So this is just a video demonstrating that. So here at Wild Otters, we call this the poop dance. So the idea behind this is essentially to spread that scat as wide as possible, possibly to give other otter families indication of territory being, taken over, who the reproductive males and females are, how many members are there in the family. There's a lot of pheromones, there's a lot of chemical signals that are being transferred through this process. And of course, as a field biologist, for us, tracking otters is essentially based entirely on following the scat. So what are the threats to the smooth-coated otter? So of course, human beings in either directly or indirectly tend to be the biggest threats. So this is an image from Singapore. These are wild otters, completely wild otters, but they moved into Singapore about 12 to 15 years ago. Before that, there were no otters in Singapore, and they're currently about 94 individuals, and they spread throughout the island, and they are pretty much thriving on invasive species of fish that went into all the local water bodies, things like carp and other fish species that were used in feng shui that kind of made their way into the waterways and took over and decimated in the endemic species of fish. Excuse me. And yeah, so the smooth-coated otter is thriving in this urban environment. Sorry. But of course, it has had to make some adaptations to things. So here you can see that there's this barrier that they need to cross over. and the pups, of course, have to be pulled over and all kinds of things like that. And these are similar things that we are now seeing on Sharau where we work. And I'll show you an image shortly of how human modification is, causing a problem for the species. So one of the biggest threats in the waterways, of course, is plastic pollution. It can be actual visible plastic such as this, or it could be microplastics that get into the ecosystem and then climb up the food chain, finally making its way into the otter. And that can be also PCBs, which are polycarbonated biphenyls, which is quite toxic and damages the endocrine system. And that changes a lot of a lot of things, including the reproductive behavior of the species. So as you can see, there's the other issue is, of course, direct threats through getting caught in fishing nets. In most cases, they get caught in fishing nets and then they can't make their way out and they drown. The other issue is that they will bite through fishing nets, take away food, livelihoods of fishermen, and that causes a conflict issue. So then fishermen tend to snare around fishing pools or near rivers and stuff like that to get rid of that otter population. Electrocution has been one of the things that is quite common on the east coast of India for prawn farming specifically. And you can see here the bottom image, there's a hook stuck in the paw, and then of course this image you can see there's a hook stuck in his eye as well as in his chin. This is again an image of the otter who had the plastic loop stuck around her and how that has gone into her skin. So this is on Sharau. This is a road where otters cross over from one fishing pool to the other. And traffic. So roadkill is a considerable threat to the smooth-coated otter and to all otters actually, and that's throughout the world, not just in India. And feral dog conflict is a major issue. So this is something that we are working on currently with the Animal Husbandry Department, Mission Rabies, and the Panchayat. We're trying to get all of them to sign off to get the feral dogs here neutered and to control the growing population. We've hit a couple of roadblocks, but hopefully in the near future we can get past those. So here's another example of, again, a human modified landscape and how otters have to sort of navigate their way through concrete structures and undulations. And this is on Sharau. So Sharau always had bunds that were human made, naturally made, that separated fishing pools and water bodies. Now they're widening those bunds, and to reinforce them, they're putting concrete structures, concrete retaining walls on either side. Now otters can't climb these retaining walls, which means that this habitat now becomes inaccessible to them. We found that otters can climb vertically as long as it's less than or equal to 60 centimeters of height. Anything higher than that, vertical, they can't get up. Now that's something that we need to sort of work with the Panchayat and other developers to sort of come up with a consensus and a way to continue development, but also to sort of make areas accessible for otters so that they can move between territories and between spaces so that they remain on this island and in other parts of Goa. The other major issue and a threat to the otter population is the illegal trade of otters. In between, so we did a study in 2016 that was published by Traffic. And essentially what we did was collected data between 1980 and 2015 from a bunch of countries throughout Asia. And a lot of people didn't get back to us. A lot of governments didn't really send back much information. But the ones that did, it came to light that right up until 2015, the trade in dead otters, and that basically encompasses skins, parts of otters, bones of otters, any part of an otter that was traded for, whether it was traditional Chinese medicine or whether it was to make coats or hats or whatever it might have been. Between 1980 and 2005, that tended to be the most confiscated, or most amount of seizures were in dead animal parts. Post that, and right up until now, it seems to be live animals, and the live animals are going for the pet trade. And that, now this data set is not only for the smooth coated otter, this is for all Asian species of otters. And that the reason for that also is that most enforcement agencies or people who are doing these seizures can't tell the species apart. So most of the data that we get, it only says otter, so we don't know which otter species it might be. But this basically gives an idea of what's going on in terms of the trade. With regards to the pet trade, most of the trading is done on social media. Here you can see these are Facebook posts from Indonesia, and these posts come up for a few hours to a few days, and then they disappear. And essentially, they show the animal, they show the number to call, they give the amount that it's going to cost for the species and the animal. And again, here is another picture. So that's otters up there. So that kind of is a very basic introduction to the smooth coated otter. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Any questions?
Yeah, so everyone watching, if you have any questions, please put them up either in the Zoom chat or the YouTube chat. Katrina, I have a question. How often do you see human otter conflict happening in Shurao on the island? And if you've seen it, what have you done about it? Is there any way to solve the conflict?
Okay, so I have so there's two ways where we've seen conflict. I've seen directly where there was a 3 or 4 otters in the water body, and the fishermen came out. They started with firecrackers, loud music, and pretty much shouting. And these otters are quite habituated to human beings, so they're not really, they scared as such. So not much happened there. And on the island itself, it hasn't progressed to the sort of conflict that you have in mind, where otters have been injured or ended up to our knowledge. Having said that, just across the island, on the other side of the bank, last year in March, there was an incident where 2 otters were at a swimming pool using bicycles. So, it definitely is happening. So now, how do you tackle such issue? While this is a really new organization, new to the island, we are still trying to fit in and become a part of the community. And that happens, or community members see that happening, we are taking it a little bit slow. But the idea is, and we hopefully in the next few weeks are going to take a community-based initiative with the Forest Department. And the basic foundation for our community work is going to be to start bring value to the ecosystem. Now, Shara is a agriculture-based society, and these ecosystems are specific, very, very important to commercial fishing industry. It's the nursery bed for a lot of species, so they come and have lay their eggs or have their babies or whatever it is within the rules of the mangrove ecosystem, and that's safe. And then they go to and they left and then they leave. So essentially, this is a important process. Okay, a lot. It's most people are moved from what happening ecologically to their livelihoods, and if we can make that connection and sort of bring value to that, and I think that's the starting point for us to sort of make a change.
Right. We have a question from Yuvan. Are there any indigenous or folkloric references to otters with a conservation perspective?
That's pretty interesting. So there's quite a lot of folklore surrounding otters. So I won't give you many examples. I give you a few, and I'll show you how that sort of, and how over the centuries it's kind of changed the perspective and the perception of otters. So let's start with Iran, Persia. When Persia was Persia. In the Zoroastrian faith, for example, otters are considered very, very sacred. They're sacred to nature, and they're sacred to God, and they're sacred to people. And there is a lot of punishments in the scripture. I think there are 18 sorts of punishments that could have been doled out uh, in the scriptures, written in the scriptures, if you harmed an otter. If I'm right, I can probably say a few of them. I think you had to kill 10,000 frogs, 10,000 snakes, or take 10,000 loads of wood to light the fire, which is sacred for Zoroastrianism. Or you would have to marry your daughter off to somebody or give away a portion of your wealth. So there was a whole bunch of things that you had to do if you harmed an otter in ancient Persia. Um, Secondary to that, if they found a dead otter in the wild, there was a whole bunch of ceremonies that one did for that situation. In Japan, in the Aboriginal communities of northern Japan, the otter is considered a very, and plays a large part in the story of creationism. So the god of heaven was actually sending the god of creationism a message, and the first time he sent the message, he sent it through a sparrow, and he said, you know you make humans in the light of wood as opposed to stone. So the sparrow gave that message, and then the god of heaven changed his mind and decided that he needed to change that entire idea, and he decided to send an otter as the messenger. And what happened then was the otter, on his way, saw a puddle of water and played there and forgot what he was supposed to do. And therefore, the god of creation just continued on his journey of making humans in light of wood. And that's why human beings are mortal and not, if they were made out of stone, of course, they would be immortal. So things like that. And then moving on from there, there is native Indian cultures which, either revered it or feared it. Post all of that into the 15th, 16th centuries, started being restricted animals that are predominantly fish, and therefore reducing the fish um, in water bodies and stuff like that. And then in the British monarchy, or the English monarchy before it became Britain, sort of started the culture of the otter hunt and created otter hounds, which is a breed of dog that was used for the otter hunt. And that kind of just continued that tradition. And then they opened it up in the 16th century, and they classified otters as women in their law. So then they put bounties put on otters, and then otter skin started being traded for, coats and things like that. So it kind of was downhill, and that led to a huge decline in otter populations throughout Europe. So yeah.
We have one question from Farishte, who is 5 years old. And her question is, how many babies does the mummy otter have at one time?
Mummy otter can have 6 babies at one time, but usually will have 2 average.
I'm sorry, could you catch the last part?
They will have 6, she can have 6 babies at a time, but will usually have 2. That's the average. 2 to 3 is the average.
Right. I had a question. So, do otters play a key role in the ecosystem that they live in, like a keystone species kind of role?
It depends which species of otter. The sea otter, which is based in North America, all the on the east coast, sorry, west coast, all the way up to Alaska down to Russia and across. In fact, all the way and sometimes the sea otters are keystone species in that they actually maintain the sea urchin population. And when the sea otter population dropped, the sea urchin population increased tremendously. And what that then ended up happening is that they ate all the kelp, and the kelp forest declined. And kelp is very important for carbon sequestering for the earth. So yeah, that had quite a tailspin effect. But luckily now it's back on the rise, and they reintroduced the sea otter to a large part of its range, and they're doing quite well. So yeah.
We have a question from Shiri, who asks, how will global warming affect smooth coated otters in the short and long run? Is there something we can do about it?
Absolutely. So, climate change in has, of course, again a lot of impacts on a lot of ecosystems and a lot of things. In context of waters, of course, changing the hydrological cycle. So we have snow, uh, we have droughts, we have flooding, we have excess precipitation. All of these things are becoming, in a sense, excessive or extreme. And that changes the geomorphology and the hydrology of riverine ecosystems, whether it's wetlands, whether it's coastal lakes, whatever it might be. They're changing the bankside tension, changing the vegetation. And more than all of that, it's changing the ability for the prey species to survive. So if there's increased turbidity, some fish may not survive in that area. And it's changing a lot of things in the trophic level itself, which will ultimately impact the otter species that depend on those ecosystems for their survival.
Katrina, I'm so sorry. Your voice got cut in the middle. Could you repeat that?
The whole thing?
Yeah, it just, I think the network wasn't great.
Yeah, so essentially, so climate change has various impacts on various things, right? So in the case of waters specifically is the hydrological change. So we have excess amounts of precipitation, we have excess amounts of drought. We have glaciers that are melting. Can you tell me?
It's just
It's just
getting a
getting
bit
a bit.
cut in the middle.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, that's better.
Yeah. So essentially, climate change will have various impacts, and that is changing the hydrology of water systems, riverine systems, wetlands, whatever they may be. They're changing the bankside, the geomorphology of these sites. So vegetation may not be able to interact with them, and it's changing everything pretty much. And it's essentially it's slow. It reduces, for example, it might reduce, so they may not be uh, habitat they require making bends or the amount of to cover all kind of things like that will have an impact on the species eventually. I can't hear you.
I'm so
I'm so
sorry.
sorry. It's okay.
There's another question from Shiri. Is there any further legislation or enforcement to help ensure the otter species survival in India?
Is there any legislation or enforcement?
Yes, to ensure the otter species survival in India.
Well, there's a lot of legislation. the one of the issues with India is that we have a central legislation. So the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, of course, is a central body. It covers well, all of India except Jammu and Kashmir, and it's a central law, and it's up to the state to enforce these laws. And each state has different degrees of enforcement. Some states enforce much better than other states, depending on, of course, how much monetary gain they get from their wild spaces. So the southern Indian states, for example, make a lot of money out of their tourism from their national parks and from their wild spaces. And whereas some states, possibly, may not be do that. So it depends. The enforcement and the regulation is a state-based subject and can vary based on a lot of factors.
Right. Um, I think we have one last question for the day, which is there any ongoing campaign to fight the otter pet trade? And is there any way we can join it?
Absolutely. So we ourselves at Wild Otters run a campaign called the Otter Collective, which is essentially one of the reasons that the otter pet trade is prevalent is because social media has extensively put images and videos of otters in a they anthropomorphized otters, or they've given them emotions, they've created videos, they've created a sort of charisma for these animals, and a lot of people watch these videos and have the need to own an otter. Essentially, what is um, letting this trade grow. So the Otter Collective is essentially it's a call to artists from around the world to join the Otter Collective to create art with the right messaging, which is that otters should be free. They're wild. Otters should be wild. They should be free, and otters shouldn't be pets. And I think that's one of the things that can be done. The other things is to when you are on social media and you come across any of these sorts of videos or photos, is to not encourage it, to not like it, and to not encourage it and not share it with anybody. That kind of will stop it from happening. Yeah, and to add one more point to the Auto Collective, we are also trying to use all of these artworks and animations and whatever it might be that is submitted to sort of counter that negative media that seems to be on the internet.
Right. I do look forward to the Otter Collective. I think we can join that as well. Thank you so much, Katrina. We loved the presentation. It was very informative. And to everyone who joined us, thank you as well. This recording will be up on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later on if you like. Um, Before signing off, I'd just like to tell you that again, the global climate strike is going on today till the end of the day. And if you have any questions, you want to reach out to us, you want to join us, you can find us on social media. Our Instagram is fridaysforfuture.india. Our Facebook is Fridays for Future, the numeral 4.india. Our Twitter is FFF India, and our email ID is fridaysforfuture.india@gmail.com. You can reach out to us for any questions you have. If you want to join us, you want to just peruse through what we've done in the past, you're very welcome to do that. Thank you for joining us, Katrina. This was a wonderful session.
Thank you.